A tweed jacket bought in 1974 is still being worn today, not restored, not vintage flipped for irony. Worn, unremarkably, the way a person wears the coat that already fits. Meanwhile, a fast fashion blazer bought 8 months ago has already been donated because the shoulder seam separated in the wash, the buttons started to shed their coating, and, more to the point, it was never going to be worn a third season anyway. It wasn't built to survive a third season. It wasn't built to survive an owner's changing mind. This is not a story about taste. It is a story about arithmetic. Old money does not avoid trends because trends are aesthetically beneath them. They avoid trends because trends are, mathematically, a terrible trade. Every dollar spent on a garment, a chair, a watch, or a house is a bet on how many years of service that dollar will return. New money, and increasingly the entire consumer economy, has been trained to make that bet badly. Old money was trained over generations to make it well. Today we go inside the actual mechanism, the cost per wear doctrine, the physics of why certain materials survive 50 years and others fail in 3, the psychology of why looking expensive is actually a new money tell, and the inheritance math that makes a $4,000 coat cheaper than a $200 one. This isn't hidden. It's just never taught. The cost per wear doctrine. Start with the number that old money families actually run quietly in their heads before almost any discretionary purchase. Cost divided by number of years in service, divided again by frequency of use. It's a simple formula, but almost nobody outside a handful of financially literate households is taught to apply it consistently. Take 2 overcoats. The first costs $180, is assembled from bonded synthetic fibers, and has a functional lifespan. Before the seams give out or the fabric pills beyond repair, of roughly 2 winters. The second costs $2,400, is cut from a heavy wool cashmere blend, hand-finished at the seams, and has a functional lifespan, with basic care, of 30 to 40 years. On raw sticker price, the first coat looks like the rational purchase. Run the actual math and the story flips entirely. The cheap coat, replaced every 2 years for 40 years, costs the wearer roughly $3,600 and requires 20 separate purchasing decisions, 20 disposal events, and 20 windows of vulnerability where the wearer has nothing adequate to wear while shopping for the replacement. The expensive coat costs $2,400 one time, requires 1 purchasing decision, and, this is the part that gets skipped, can often be resoled, relined, or retailored for a fraction of replacement cost when it does eventually show wear. This is the calculation embedded, almost unconsciously, in old money purchasing behavior. It isn't a spreadsheet exercise done at the point of sale. It's a value system absorbed young enough that it doesn't feel like math anymore. It feels like instinct. The same way a person raised around fine wine can identify a corked bottle without needing to explain the chemistry. But underneath the instinct, the chemistry, or in this case, the arithmetic, is real, and it is learnable by anyone who chooses to run the numbers deliberately. The framework has a name in old money households, though it's rarely spoken aloud as a framework. It's just how things are done. We'll call it, for clarity, the 50-year test. Before a major purchase, the implicit question is not, can I afford this? But, will this still be useful, structurally sound, and worth owning in 50 years? And if not, why am I buying it at all instead of something disposable and cheaper? The test filters out 2 categories of goods simultaneously: cheap goods that were never going to survive, and trend goods that were never going to remain relevant, regardless of how well built they are. A perfectly stitched garment in a hypercurrent silhouette fails the 50-year test just as surely as a poorly stitched one, because in 10 years it will read as dated, even if it hasn't physically fallen apart. This is why old money wardrobes, homes, and furnishings skew so heavily toward classic forms, not out of aesthetic conservatism for its own sake, but because classic forms are the only category of goods that can mathematically clear a 50-year holding period without a forced write-down in relevance. There's a term from finance that maps onto this almost perfectly: total cost of ownership, or TCO, a concept every corporate procurement department uses when buying equipment, but one that rarely gets applied by individual consumers to individual consumer goods. Corporations don't buy the cheapest forklift. They buy the forklift with the lowest total cost of ownership over its expected service life, which accounts for purchase price, maintenance cost, downtime cost, and resale value. Old money households, whether or not they've ever used the term, apply exactly this logic to shoes, luggage, kitchenware, and furniture. It is a household run like a small, permanent institution rather than a series of disconnected purchasing impulses. If you've never run the cost per wear math on something you own, pause here and do it on one item right now. Divide the price by how many times you'll actually use it. Drop the number in the comments. I want to see what it looks like when people actually run this for the first time. There's a second layer to the cost per wear doctrine that's easy to miss: the compounding cost of decision fatigue. Every time a cheap good fails and needs replacing, the owner has to spend not just money, but time, attention, and the resource old money families guard most jealously: cognitive bandwidth. A household that buys disposable furniture is a household perpetually mid-search for its next couch. A household that bought one very good couch in 1988 has, since 1988, spent 0 hours thinking about couches. That freed bandwidth gets redirected toward business, toward relationships, toward the kind of long-horizon thinking that actually builds and preserves wealth. This is a subtle but real mechanism by which buying for durability compounds into something larger than the savings on the item itself. It is time arbitrage disguised as a shopping habit. The physics of 50 years. Durability is not a vibe. It is a set of measurable material and construction properties, and understanding them is what separates genuine buy-for-life purchasing from marketing copy that simply claims durability without delivering it. Start with fiber and grain. In textiles, the difference between a garment that lasts 2 years and one that lasts 40 almost always comes down to fiber length and weave density. Long staple cotton, full grain leather, and worsted wool share a structural property. Their fibers are long and continuous, which means less friction at the cut ends, less pilling, less fraying, and dramatically higher tensile strength over repeated stress cycles. Cheap synthetic blends and split-grain leather are, by contrast, built from shorter, more processed fibers that were selected for cost and speed of manufacture rather than longevity. This isn't snobbery, it's materials science. A leather bag made from full-grain hide will, with use, develop a patina. The surface actually improves with age as oils and light interact with the material. A bag made from bonded or split leather, coated in polyurethane to imitate that look, will crack and peel within a few years because the coating is not the material. It's a print on top of a weaker material underneath. Furniture tells the same story through joinery. A dovetail joint or a mortise and tenon joint, cut by hand or by precision machinery into solid hardwood, distributes stress across an interlocking mechanical structure. It can be disassembled, tightened, and reassembled generations later. A joint held together by glue, particle board, and cam lock fasteners, the standard construction method for most mass-market furniture, has a single point of failure: the bond. Once the glue lets go or the particle board core crumbles around the fastener, the piece cannot be meaningfully repaired. It becomes landfill by design, not by accident. This is the quiet secret of flat-pack furniture economics. The business model depends on a predictable failure window, because a chair that lasted 50 years would only need to be sold once per customer per half-century, which is a much worse business than a chair that needs replacing every 5 to 8 years. Old money households don't necessarily know the phrase mortise and tenon. What they know, generationally, is which furniture makers built things that survived their grandparents' households intact, and they keep buying, or keep the pieces already bought, from that same category of construction. The knowledge is transmitted as brand and maker reputation, but the reputation itself was earned through exactly this kind of structural engineering. The same logic extends to mechanical goods. A mechanical watch movement, properly serviced roughly once a decade, can run accurately for well over a century. There are movements from the 1800s still keeping time today. A quartz fashion watch with a sealed, non-serviceable battery compartment is engineered for a 5 to 10 year lifespan before it becomes cheaper to discard than repair. Cars follow a parallel pattern at a different price point. Certain mechanically simple, over-engineered vehicles from specific manufacturers and eras are still on the road at 300,000 or 400,000 miles because they were built with accessible, rebuildable components, while other vehicles are designed around sealed, non-serviceable modules that make major repair cost prohibitive by the time the vehicle hits 120,000 miles. Engineered obsolescence expressed through the parts bin rather than through marketing. There's a broader principle underneath all of this, and it's worth stating plainly because it's the thesis of the entire episode. Cheapness and durability are not two ends of the same spectrum you can dial up or down freely. Past a certain threshold, they become mutually exclusive, because a manufacturer competing purely on price has to remove cost from somewhere, and the two easiest places to remove cost are material quality and joinery/construction complexity, which are exactly the two variables that determine whether an object survives 10 years or 50. This is exactly the kind of mechanism-level breakdown this channel exists for. Not old money looks like this, but old money works like this, and here's the engineering and the math underneath it. If that's useful to you, the subscribe button is the best way to make sure you catch the next one. We're going deep on the old money furniture buying playbook next. 3 objects, 1 philosophy. To make the abstraction concrete, walk through 3 specific object categories where the 50-year philosophy is most visible: the suit, the shoe, and the watch. These 3 items form something close to a curriculum in old money households, not because they're the most expensive things a person can own, but because they are the objects most frequently used as a training ground for teaching the underlying doctrine to the next generation. The suit, a bespoke or high-quality made-to-measure suit, properly constructed, is built around a canvas interlining, a structured layer of horsehair or wool canvas stitched, not glued, between the outer fabric and the lining. This canvas is what allows the jacket to be let out, taken in, and re-tailored as the wearer's body changes over decades, sometimes across 2 or 3 owners across a family. A fused suit, the mass-market construction method, where a layer of adhesive-backed interfacing is heat-pressed to the fabric instead of stitched, cannot be meaningfully altered, and the fusing itself tends to separate and bubble after repeated dry cleaning cycles, usually within a few years. The canvassed suit costs more upfront and, worn and cared for properly, can remain in rotation for 20 to 30 years, being recut as needed. This is why old money tailoring advice so consistently emphasizes buying fewer suits of higher construction quality rather than a rotating wardrobe of trend-cut pieces. The trend-cut piece is not just aesthetically perishable, it's often structurally perishable too, because trend garments are disproportionately manufactured, using the cheaper fusing method to hit lower price points and faster production cycles. The shoe. The construction method that matters here is called Goodyear-welting, a technique where the upper, a leather welt strip, and the sole are stitched together in a way that allows the sole to be fully removed and replaced without damaging the shoe's upper, or shape. A pair of Goodyear-welted shoes, resoled every few years, can remain in a family for multiple decades and, cared for properly, sometimes multiple owners. A cemented shoe, where the sole is simply glued to the upper, the dominant construction method for mass market and fast fashion footwear, cannot be resoled at all. Once the sole wears through or the adhesive fails, the shoe is finished. This is a case where the durability difference isn't a matter of degree, it's a binary structural feature. One shoe was engineered to be repaired indefinitely. The other was engineered to be discarded once. The watch. We touched on the mechanical movement already, but the philosophy runs deeper than the movement itself. A well-made mechanical watch is designed, from the outset, around the assumption that it will be serviced, opened, cleaned, relubricated, and reassembled, roughly once every 5 to 10 years, indefinitely, for as long as the owner wants to keep it running. The entire object is engineered around a maintenance relationship, not a replacement cycle. This is a genuinely different design philosophy from almost anything else sold in the modern consumer economy, where the default assumption is that the object will be discarded, not maintained. Old money households that pass down a specific watch across 3 generations aren't engaging in sentimentality alone. They're engaging with an object that was built, at the design level, to make that multi-generational use case possible. What unites all 3 objects is a single design principle: repairability as a first-order design goal, not an afterthought. Cheap goods are not cheap because their designers are less skilled. They are cheap because repairability was deliberately traded away in favor of lower unit cost and faster manufacturing throughput. Expensive, durable goods are not simply better made in some vague quality sense. They are made according to an entirely different value hierarchy, one that treats the 50-year lifespan as the design target rather than the 5-year lifespan. The household as an institution. Zoom out from individual objects to the household as a whole, and the same doctrine appears at a larger scale, applied to furniture, silver, china, and the built environment of the home itself. Old money households frequently contain furniture that predates every living member of the family. This is not simply inherited sentimentality. It reflects a purchasing philosophy in which furniture is treated less like a consumer good and more like institutional infrastructure, the same way a university treats its library building or a government treats a courthouse. Infrastructure is not replaced on a trend cycle. It is maintained, restored, and occasionally expanded, but the core structure is expected to outlive the individuals currently using it. This reframing changes the entire cost calculation. a dining table purchased once for a price that would strike a first-generation buyer as shocking, and then used continuously across 4 generations, amortizes down to a genuinely tiny annual cost per year of service, often lower on a true per-year basis than a mid-range replacement table bought new every 15 years. But the emotional experience of the purchase is completely different in the two cases. The old money buyer experiences one large, deliberate outlay followed by decades of zero decision-making. The trend cycle buyer experiences a long series of smaller outlays, each of which feels individually more affordable, but which never stop, and which, this is the part that's easy to underweight, carry a hidden tax in the form of recurring decision fatigue, recurring disposal logistics, and recurring vulnerability to whatever the current trend happens to be at each replacement point. Silver is a particularly clean example of this doctrine because, unlike furniture, silver has an actual, quantifiable floor value, the metal itself. A set of solid sterling silver flatware, bought once, used at every family dinner for 80 years, passed down, and never once considered for replacement, retains melt value even in the worst-case scenario where it's neither wanted nor usable. Silver-plated flatware, plate applied over a base metal, has no such floor. Once the plating wears through from repeated polishing and use, which happens gradually but inevitably over a few decades of heavy use, the piece is functionally worthless. The old money preference for solid silver over plate is, again, not primarily an aesthetic preference. It's a hedge against total value loss, engineered directly into the metallurgy of the object. China follows a similar but distinct logic: pattern permanence. Old money households frequently maintain relationships with the same china pattern, sometimes from the same manufacturer, across generations. Not because no new pattern has ever caught their eye, but because a permanent, unchanging pattern means a chipped or broken piece can be replaced individually decades later without disrupting the set. This is a form of foresight almost entirely absent from trend-driven homeware purchasing, where a pattern is often discontinued within a few years, meaning any breakage forces a full-set replacement rather than a single-piece repair. The household is, in effect, designed around long-term serviceability at every layer, from the furniture down to the plates. Here's a question for the comments. What's the oldest functional item in your household right now? Something still doing its job after decades. I read every one of these, and I want to build out a future episode featuring the best examples from this community. The psychology. Why looking expensive is a new money tell. There's a sociological concept worth introducing here, developed by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. The idea that wealth expresses itself not just through money, but through what he called cultural capital. Accumulated knowledge, taste, and habits that function as a kind of currency in themselves, often more durable and more difficult to fake than money alone. The economist Thorstein Veblen, writing decades earlier, described a related but distinct phenomenon, conspicuous consumption, where goods are purchased specifically because their high price signal status, and where, in a genuinely strange inversion of ordinary economics, demand for certain goods can actually rise as the price rises, because the price itself is the product being purchased. Old money spending behavior is best understood as a deliberate rejection of Veblen's logic in favor of Bourdieu's. A newly wealthy buyer, still calibrating what wealth is supposed to look like, often gravitates toward goods that visibly announce their price. Large logos, recognizable branding, styling that reads unmistakably as new and current. This is not irrational. It's a reasonable strategy for someone who needs to establish status quickly in a social environment where credentials aren't yet known. But it is a strategy with a shelf life, because visible logos and current styling age in years, not decades, and each new season's iteration makes the previous season's purchase look dated by comparison, not enhanced by history. Old money buyers, operating inside social networks where their financial position is already established and doesn't need to be advertised through the goods they carry, optimize for a completely different signal, evidence of duration. A leather bag that has visibly aged, scuffed corners, softened grain, a patina built from years of actual use, signals something a brand new logo-forward bag cannot signal at any price. That the owner's wealth predates this particular purchase, potentially by decades. This is the mechanism behind the well-worn old money maxim that genuine wealth doesn't need to announce itself. It's not a moral statement about humility. It's a signaling strategy that only becomes available to people whose wealth is already old enough to have visibly aged objects to show for it. New money, by definition, hasn't had time to accumulate that evidence yet, which is precisely why it often reaches for a different, faster-acting signal instead. There's a related concept worth naming. The sociologist Mark Granovetter's research on social networks and what he called weak ties, the loose, extended network of acquaintances rather than close friends, through which most opportunity and information actually flows. Old money social and professional networks are built and maintained over decades, often across generations of the same families interacting in the same institutions. Within those networks, quality signaling through durable, understated goods functions as a kind of insider recognition system. People who share the same reference points recognize a well-aged full-grain leather bag or a hand-finished suit that's clearly been retailored over the years as evidence of belonging to the same long-standing world in a way that a brand-new logo item cannot replicate, precisely because it lacks the one thing that can't be purchased quickly: time. This is worth stating directly because it's often misunderstood by newer audiences to this content. Old money's preference for understated, durable goods over branded trend goods is not a moral or aesthetic superiority claim. It is a rational response to a different set of constraints and a different time horizon. A household with a 50-year purchasing horizon and an already established social position optimizes for different variables than a household still in the process of establishing itself. Both strategies can be rational for the position the buyer is actually in. What's useful for anyone watching this, regardless of their starting point, is understanding that the 50-year strategy is available to adopt deliberately at any income level, once the underlying doctrine is understood, because it isn't really about how much money a purchase costs. It's about how the purchase is evaluated before the money is spent. The hidden cost of cheap. There's a final layer to this doctrine that's almost never discussed in mainstream personal finance content, because it doesn't show up on a single receipt. The compounding cost of the replacement cycle itself, distributed across time, money, and attention simultaneously. Consider a household that buys furniture, clothing, and household goods on the cheap and frequent model across a 40-year adult life. Each individual purchase looks affordable in isolation, but the household is, in aggregate, running dozens of replacement cycles across dozens of categories simultaneously: shoes, coats, furniture, kitchenware, luggage, each on its own independent failure timeline. The result is a household in a state of near-permanent low-grade shopping, permanently exposed to a few compounding costs that rarely get named directly. the sunk cost of items discarded before their expected lifespan due to trend obsolescence rather than physical failure. The transaction cost in time and cognitive load of constantly researching replacement purchases in categories the household has solved and then unsolved a dozen times over. And the disposal cost, logistical, financial, and increasingly environmental, of managing a continuous stream of discarded goods. There's also a less obvious cost, the erosion of expertise. A household that buys one very good pair of boots and resoles them for 20 years develops, over time, a genuine, hard-won understanding of exactly how that specific object performs, fails, and can be maintained. Deep, applied knowledge. A household cycling through a new pair of cheap boots every year never develops that expertise, because there's never enough continuity with any single object to learn its specific behavior. This might sound like a minor point, but it maps onto something larger, a general life philosophy of depth over breadth, applied not just to relationships and skills, but to objects. Old money households are, in this narrow sense, unusually deep experts on a fairly narrow set of goods, brands, and makers, because they've had the same relationship with those goods for decades, sometimes generations. And expertise of that kind simply cannot be compressed into a shorter time frame, no matter how much is spent. We're about to get into the actual decision framework, the specific questions old money households run before any major purchase. So if you've made it this far, stay with me for the next 4 minutes, because this is the part people actually screenshot and save. Beyond objects. The same logic in real estate and vehicles. The 50-year doctrine doesn't stop at wardrobes and dining tables. It extends, with only minor modification, into the 2 largest asset categories most households ever purchase: property and vehicles. Old money real estate preference consistently favors older, well-built structures over new construction, and the reasoning tracks the same mechanism we've covered throughout this episode. Buildings constructed decades or centuries ago, particularly by builders working before the era of mass-produced, cost-optimized construction materials, frequently used solid masonry, old-growth timber, and construction techniques designed for multi-generational occupancy rather than a standard mortgage cycle lifespan. New construction, particularly at the lower and middle end of the market, is disproportionately built to a cost target and a codes compliance minimum rather than a durability target, using materials, engineered wood products, thinner gauge fixtures, cost-optimized insulation and roofing that are adequate but not engineered for the multi-generational holding period old money households implicitly plan around. This is one reason old money property portfolios so often skew toward renovated older properties, rather than new builds. The underlying structure was engineered in a different economic era, around a different and much longer time horizon. Vehicles follow a related but distinct version of the same logic, filtered through a slightly different lens: depreciation curves rather than pure durability. Old money vehicle purchasing behavior, famously understated, favoring practical, mechanically simple, unshowy vehicles kept in service for a decade or more, reflects an awareness that a vehicle's value collapses fastest in its first few years, and that buying into the trend cycle of current model year styling means voluntarily absorbing the steepest part of that depreciation curve repeatedly, every few years, indefinitely. Buying a mechanically sound, well-maintained vehicle and keeping it in service for its full useful life, often a decade or two, well past the point where trend-driven buyers would have already replaced it twice, sidesteps most of that depreciation entirely. The car becomes, in effect, a fully amortized tool rather than a recurring, compounding expense. The actual decision framework. Bring the entire episode down into something genuinely usable. The actual questions, distilled from everything covered, that map onto how old money households implicitly evaluate a major purchase before making it. Question 1. What is the true cost per year of service, not the sticker price? Divide the purchase price by the realistic number of years the item will remain functional and relevant, not the number of years until it merely becomes unfashionable. Question 2. Is this item repairable, and by whom? An item with a genuine, accessible repair path, resoling, retailoring, recanvassing, movement servicing, should be weighted differently from an item that is functionally disposable by design, regardless of how the two items compare on sticker price alone. Question 3. Will this still be structurally and stylistically relevant in 10, 20, or 50 years? This filters out both poor construction and trend-driven design simultaneously, because both categories fail this specific test, just on different timelines and for different reasons. Question 4. What is this item made of at the material level, and does that material improve, hold steady, or degrade with age and use? Full-grain leather, solid hardwood, solid silver, and long staple natural fibers tend to hold, or improve, with age. Bonded materials, particle board, plated metal, and short staple synthetic blends tend to degrade, often faster than the sticker price would suggest. Question 5. Does owning this item require ongoing decision-making, or does it settle the category permanently? A household that has bought its final set of cookware, its final coat, its final dining table, has freed a permanent slice of future attention that a household still shopping in that category indefinitely has not. Run any prospective purchase through these 5 questions, and the 50-year doctrine stops being an inherited instinct exclusive to old money households and becomes a deliberate, learnable, and genuinely replicable purchasing framework, available to anyone willing to apply it consistently over enough purchases and enough years for the compounding to show up. If this framework was useful, I'd genuinely appreciate a thumbs up. It's the single biggest factor in whether this channel keeps getting recommended to people who'd find this valuable. And if you want the next layer down, the specific brands and makers old money families have quietly trusted for generations, that's coming in an upcoming video, so make sure you're subscribed before it goes up. None of this is secret knowledge locked away in old money households by design. It's knowledge that simply isn't transmitted outside of them because it was never written down as a system. It was absorbed as habit, generation after generation, until it stopped looking like a strategy and started looking like taste. But it is a strategy, a cost per wear calculation, a repairability audit, a material science filter, a depreciation curve avoidance tactic. Run consistently over decades across every category of household spending, it produces something that looks, from the outside, like inherited elegance, but is, underneath, closer to inherited engineering. This isn't hidden. It's just never taught. If you want the next layer of this system, how old money actually vets, the makers and brands worth trusting with a 50-year purchase, that's the next video. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.